Good afternoon, Matakayape, Ampetu Kine, Shante Washte. I am Representative Mary Kunesh-Podein, and I want to welcome all of you and thank you for being here today to listen and learn and contribute to a conversation that's really important, not just to our Indigenous communities, but to our state and to our nation, and actually globally. I am a state legislator. I represent District 41B, which is a first-ring suburb down in the Twin Cities. And I also come from a long line of very strong, beautiful Lakota women. My grandfather was born in Standing Rock, and he and my mother were enrolled. My generation was the cutoff, but we always carried with pride our heritage and the traits that are so important to us as an Indigenous person. I was elected to the House of Representatives in 2016, and in that year I was also elected along with another new representative, Representative Jamie Becker-Finn. And she and I joined two other Native American women. Susan Allen was the very first Native American woman that was elected to the House of Representatives. And a few years later, our now Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, joined Susan at the House, and then Jamie and I joined, and we created the very first Native American caucus at the Minnesota State Legislature, which is sort of a sad thing, but it's also something very much to celebrate. And within that, thank you, and in a little bit broader sense, we also were elected with a number of other legislators of color in that election year, and created the Posse Caucus at the state legislature, People of Color Indigenous, so POCI. When you see that, a lot of people have is it Pocky, what is it? But we have created a strong coalition of legislators of color that are really pressing and pushing and educating around issues that have really affected our marginalized communities, and it continues to grow every single election. So we hope to add more and more to our Posse Caucus. And that includes the state Senate as well as the state legislature. So to get back to our subject today on missing and murdered Indigenous women, in 2017 I heard the preliminary report on Canada's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. It was the same summer that Savannah Graywin went missing, and we heard the tragedy of her story and the loss of her, though her young daughter was with us today. But that was really what spurred me, and I thought, if Canada is doing this, why aren't we doing this? If North Dakota has legislation, why doesn't Minnesota? And then I had that epiphany, Minnesota, I am a state legislator, that is my job to do this. And so that summer I worked very hard on creating a very grassroots, Indigenous-led group, a study group, shall we say, of organizations and individuals and professionals who had some historic and current information around violence against women in the Indigenous communities. And we built a preliminary bill, and then they would look at it and say, tweak this, add this, don't add that, here's who should be on this task force. And lo and behold, we built this incredible task force here in Minnesota to study the missing and murdered Indigenous women. That year, with the help of quite a few people, we were able to introduce it. And I think we really needed that year to understand the significance of this historic trauma in our Indigenous communities. So many of our legislators, so many folks across Minnesota who are decision makers, who are policy makers and service providers had no idea of this whole phenomena, shall we say. And it was horrifying and very emotional at the state capitol as well as in the communities. And I think we needed that introduction just to understand it and deal with the trauma and the emotion. The very next year, I was able to introduce it again, and we were able to pass that legislation to create the task force in 2018, which is quite historic. It's probably the most comprehensive piece of legislation around the task around missing and murdered situation. And so in some ways, I feel like Minnesota once again is a leader in this area. And so the task force was created in the legislative body of 2018. 2019, it passed in the spring of 2019, just last year. And we have spent the entire summer working really hard on building up the committees and subcommittees, meeting across the state with stakeholders and those that are working hard on this. And I'm really proud to say that we've really started to build some coalition between tribal, county, state, and federal agencies. And the first report is due out at the end of this year, and we will have some really good suggestions to start with. It's just a 2-year task force, but we are working very, very hard on it. And it's things like this, it's events like this that are so important to help us stay grounded and hear from communities, hear from individuals, and then provide a way for those such as the uptake and the other agencies to also become a partner and join our coalition around this whole situation. So today is a really wonderful day. I want to thank once again Roxanne DeLeo for her beautiful opening ceremony and the prayers. I don't know about you, but I was overtaken with emotion and goosebumps a number of times, so that's always a good sign when somebody can provoke those kind of reactions. This afternoon we have a great panel discussion, and it will include questions from the audience. So if you have questions, there are little cards and pens that you can grab to ask our panelists. We have, first of all, Rose Whipple, who is an Indigenous youth leader. And next we have Sarah Curtis, who is with Men as Peacemakers. And thirdly, we have Rene Ann Goodrich, who works with Native Lives Matter. And so I think we would like to give them all a little bit of time to introduce themselves and talk about the work that they're doing and anything that they want to share with us as the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Thank you.
Hamatakiapi, Rose Whipple, Amakiapi, Santi Hamataha. Hello everybody, my name is Rose Whipple. I'm from the Santi Dakota and Ho-Chunk Nations. I'm 18 years old, and my work, I don't know like calling it my work. I'm just an Indigenous youth trying to survive, trying to fight for my people, trying to do what's right for the next 7 generations. I'm also one of the 13 youth climate interveners who were involved in the pipeline case against the Line 3 pipeline. We were legal interveners for about a year, and after the pipeline being approved, we are now suing the state of Minnesota for approving the pipeline. So yeah, I'm just out here fighting pipelines. I also just got back from Spain, where I was at COP25, which is the convening of parties, which is where all the countries in the world, all of the large corporations that are causing climate change meet up to discuss how they're going to solve it and what they're going to do. And so I got to speak on a panel with youth from Uganda, Chile, me being from Minnesota, of course, representing, and a few other youth from countries that are not represented and that are facing climate change today, right now, where their people are dying on the front lines. And yeah, it's been an amazing experience to do this work, but also the main reason why I am doing this work is to raise awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women. You know, as a young Indigenous woman, I am impacted. You know, my relatives are impacted, my family's impacted, my friends are impacted. So it's my job to, you know, help raise this awareness, as seeing this every day, as hearing from my sisters, you know, what we all have to go through just living, trying to be human, but not being able to be young, to be a woman in a safe space. Every day we're just fighting to survive, and it shouldn't be like that. You know, we should get to be young, to be teenagers, to be young kids, to grow up, be a woman, and not have to go through all this. So that's why I'm here. Hope you like.
Bonjour, Indigenous Margaret, Circus Indigenous Kajangana, Kimi Payashik, Indigo and Shinabe, gives me good morning, afternoon. My name is Sarah Curtis, and so my work jobs is I'm the co-executive director for an organization called Men as Peacemakers. I find I have to put a pause after that, otherwise they're like menace peacemakers. What is it? Men as Peacemakers. And also I'm the keeper of traditional ways, or the board president for the Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition. But what brings me here today is that I'm an Anishinaabe woman, I'm a mom and an auntie, I am a friend, and the work that I do for closer to 20 years than 10 is I hold a sacred responsibility of sitting with families like mine, that are impacted, that have lost too many people because of this, too many people. And so, so I sit here as a person that that really believes in the power of our communities and really believes in creating that soft ground to hold those families of our relatives that that don't get to come home. So, miigwech viztali.
Bonjour. I'm glad to be here. Rene Ann Goodrich, Jaganashimang. I'm a tribal elder from Bad River, a grandmother, an activist, organizer, and advocate for families at the front line of missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement. I want to say miigwech for everyone that has showed up. Awesome, Rose and Sarah, miigwech for all the beautiful work that you do to help bring awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women here in Minnesota. We've been organizing, I work with Native Lives Matter group that was created in the Twin Cities 2014 down in St. Paul, and more recently focusing on missing and murdered Indigenous women with the Native Lives Matter Coalition. I like the work of the coalition because I'm able to do a lot of outreach into the communities and support to families. We started the march down in Minneapolis with awesome nonprofit tribal sister coalitions of Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition, Men in a Sacred Hoop Coalition, with and bringing these marches to help build this awareness this past 6 years. The Minneapolis March this year will be the 6th annual march, and the orgs that are leading down there is the tribal coalitions and advocates working directly with family members. So we're really proud of that. This is our 6th year. In Duluth, this will be our 5th year walking and honoring for missing and murdered Indigenous women. I do the organizing and the outreach to families and communities directly impacted by the loss of their loved ones. I've been honored by many doors that have opened as a community member, being able to walk through these doors and supported by Indigenous communities, Fond du Lac, here this space, Fond du Lac Tribal Community College, also Mending the Sacred Hoop up in Duluth. So it's been beautiful support, working with community, and the movement keeps growing. One of the things that I wanted to share about the phenomenon of the movement that's happened here in Minnesota is the movements started about a decade ago with the Violence Against Women Act and advocates supporting that legislation. And it has moved from, in the past 8 years, I would say, it has moved from organizations lobbying for legislation to support the Violence Against Women Act to families taking it upon themselves to come out into the streets and advocate for their lost loved ones. So it was quite a flip how that started to grow, that the movement began with families advocating for their lost loved ones out of pocket, purely grassroots on a donated, individual families donating, to demand visibility and justice for their lost loved ones. And that's how the marches began in Minneapolis. A beautiful, organic, grassroots, families advocating for their lost loved ones. So families are the foundation to the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement. It's families working to bring awareness, justice, call for justice for their lost loved ones out in the streets, and it's families who are doing the strongest advocacy in this missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement. And it's also families that are pushing for long-standing legislative changes that we've recently begun to see happen here since in the past 3 years, I would say, that families are pushing for those long-standing changes. So I encourage you to please support families of missing and murdered Indigenous women in their events and their local community members. Reach out to families and stand and walk with them. So the movement has begun very organically with families and has grown to include multiple collaborations of nonprofits that represent environmental issues, sexual assault, domestic violence, racial inequality, historical, gender-based violence. It's to include all of these organizations is the collaborative and the coalition work that I do. It's my belief to bring all these organizations and these groups together and being that powerful, strong voice with family members is what's pushing legislative changes. During the year 2019, we've had a huge wave of women that was voted into legislative places for representatives in the House and in the Senate. So that has really helped to make changes and support to families in their efforts to create this long-standing legislation that needs to happen for missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I wanted to say miigwech and thank you. And so I'll be here to share some local community events that are happening throughout the month of February that will be declaring Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Month. Miigwech.
Thank you, Renee. Renee mentioned that February 14th there will be marches, red shawl marches around the state. I am working on a proclamation with the governor to recognize February as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Month in Minnesota, and there are many, many other ways that we're bringing the attention to our communities. I know when I started this work on the missing and murdered, memories from our families rise to the surface. There was concern from folks that perhaps this would scratch an old wound, open an old wound, and cause additional trauma to our communities. And for any of those folks that might be experiencing that, as we bring the truth to the forefront, we profusely apologize, but at the same time, there were so many folks that said, no, we need to hear these stories. We need to hear the stories. People need to speak their truth to this, because that's the only way we will get change and we will be taken, seriously enough. And I remember as a young girl, my mother and my aunties whispering about something that was happening back at Standing Rock. They had a cousin named Elsie, and Elsie, I remembered, had gone missing and something tragic happened. And when this came up, this whole missing and murdered, that memory came into my mind, and we went back and we looked to find out what was behind the story. And if you follow newspaper articles or stories within the family, we've come to realize that Elsie, after losing her children in a fire, was self-medicating and got hooked up with some, unkind, bad people. I really believe that she was trafficked and taken out of the state, and it was after months of not hearing from her that the family was notified and told that she had committed suicide in a hotel that had been rented by a couple of men. So, if we put all those things together in this day, in this context, I have a sense that my mother's cousin, Elsie, had been trafficked and could be considered a missing and murdered Indigenous woman. And for that reason, I feel like this is another reason why I need to continue this work. And we've had so many good allies along the way, agencies and those that are working with violence against our Indigenous women. But my question is to each of you is, who are some of the people that have supported you in this endeavor? And I'm just kind of thinking, Rose, you're a young girl, you traveled to Spain, you seem to have that sense of power to stand up and speak where generations of women haven't had that. And so for each of you, I'm just wondering, who is it that mentored you or gave you the strength to stand up and fight for this really important issue at this time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the reason why I started doing this work was from seeing other youth do it. I was 15 at the time, and Standing Rock was happening. It was just the beginning stages. And the youth that had started Standing Rock, I had seen them all over Facebook Live, all over the place, and I had never seen that before. I had never seen Indigenous youth rising up, speaking their truth, and actually winning. Shutting down pipeline, shutting down construction is a crazy thing to do, and it made me realize that I could literally be doing the same thing, and that anybody could. And so yeah, that's what I did. And So it's really just from seeing other people do it and empowering me. And from there, other women in my community have empowered me. Other women who are doing this work have really empowered me and have helped mentor me and lead me along the way. And just other youth standing with each other. I do most of my work with other youth who are my age from different backgrounds, mainly people of color. And just holding each other accountable and together, just supporting each other. It's really great to just have a community that's like supporting you. And that's what I've had, and I think it's important to find that in order to do this work, because doing this work alone is super, super hard. And you know, if you're doing this work alone, you're not doing it in a good way, because we're doing this work for each other, with each other. So.
Asked, what was the question again? Who supported me?
Who was your mentor?
The mentors.
Yeah.
And my inspiration for starting the work was my own personal healing journey. Was in a place of grief and loss of my sisters and my mom that passed away all in a short time. And it was this grief. The marches, working with family members and reaching out to community for support. The marches were a healing walk for myself. And the first marches in Minneapolis were very organic, with families coming out and demanding justice. And the walks were very healing for them. So that is part of my own personal healing journey. The advocacy and in activism, the healing and seeking justice and working through grief to understand great loss. So I have a keen, deep understanding of grief and how grief impacts families. And it's through this that I'm able to help support community members and family members of lost loved ones. As I was organizing the first original marches down in Minneapolis, I had beautiful supporters that come out, inspired. I was inspired by the power and the brilliance of the Idle No More Minnesota organizers, women who worked with Idle No More organizers, my sister organizers, but also the elders. I've always reached out to the elders and family members first, and community members, and it was this beautiful, loving support of the local elders. Mary Lyons, Sharon Day. It was this beautiful love that flowed out and supported me as I organized, and I could always depend upon them to come and support the marches. Without question, I would ask for them to please come out and speak and help support, and they were always there. So it's the elders in each individual communities that I've worked. So I've made it a point to, as a practice, to reach out to those individual community elders first, because that's where the majority of my support would come through, and I needed that for my individual healing and direction also, so that it was appropriate and that I was able to follow protocol, and each community is different. To gain that elder support in each individual community while I'm working with family members out in the community is huge. And so I'm just saying miigwech to my my Auntie Mary Lyons for being here today. Much love to you, and Miigwech for all the support to me through the years. So those were some of my strongest inspirations, was the elders, the tribal elders in each individual community, and also my family.
So I think about who inspired me and who inspires me, and I just want to say Rene Ann is one of those people. And that she's been a very, very good example about how you be in community in a good way, and has been a patient teacher for me for a very long time. And so it is an honor to sit next to her and to my younger sister right here. I think about too, it's actually, this is the home, actually, when I came here in college. It's a very scared young woman. I look at Roxanne, who listened to unending hours of my spazziness. I remember as I would be like, and what about this? And what about this? And what about this, right? As I was learning things, right? And so holding this place, and I even look at in the room, my younger sibling, Courtney, I met you when you were a baby. Now you've got a 6-year-old, and I think about some of those kind of conversations that we had together. So the community holds me, and as my little sister said, you don't do this work by yourself, otherwise you're not doing it in that good way. And I think about what started is, I'm a survivor of a lot of violence in my life, and the very first stories in my family that I learned are the murder of my biological grandmother, right? With my mom, when I never even knew her, right? She was murdered. My mother was 15 years old, and I come from a really long line of badass, bougie aunties, right? That got our lipstick and our nails done and will fight you tooth and nail still at the same time. And that kind of inspiration right there. And I said I've had the sacred honor of sitting with so many families and learning from them and holding story for them and sitting and talking story with them. And then my ceremony and dreams too, that the generosity of my relatives who have gone on the other side still come and teach me. So I was just like crying my little eyeballs out, thank God for waterproof mascara while Roxanne was praying. And my friend that passed away, and I'm careful with names, especially with live stream, to honor their families, right? But I just felt her next to me being like, just crying around again, huh? Like, just go talk, for heaven's sakes, right? Why are you always crying around? And having like that, those people really, really close to my heart, because I miss that. I feel it, that they're not here with us. And I'm here. And so because I'm here, I'm gonna do my best job for them. I'm gonna do my best job for them. And I'm gonna stand up for them, and I'm going to talk, and I'm going to educate, and I'm going to fight, but fight with love, right? And I'm radically going to do my very best to live to be an old person for them. And so when I talk about what inspires me is that every single day, there's not one day that I don't go without thinking about everybody, right? In that good 7th-generation way of the people from the past and the people who are here, and then the people who are gonna come and be here with us later. So many questions.
So you can see this is a very emotional subject, and last year on my way to the march on February 14th, had been asked to say a few words about the task force, and I had, again, another revelation or epiphany that every one of us who carry Native American blood or chromosomes or DNA, every one of us are here because another woman survived. They survived the violence of colonization. They survived illness and alcoholism and violence and intentional attempts to eradicate a whole population across North America. But it was because of one woman handing down her DNA, generation by generation, that all of us are here. And we are here to make sure that really continues. And that's why we join. I did not know a single person in this room before I started working on this task force. And you mentioned this floor and the connecting lines, and goosebumps all over again. And I think this is the kind of work that we really probably were meant to do, and we were put in a place and a time with a voice for those reasons. And so for those reasons, I am eternally grateful. One other question I want to ask you before we go to a couple audience. We know that the violence against women has direct connection to colonization and expansion of white people across our continent. But we also know in this day and age, and you mentioned Standing Rock and the pipeline, and there is direct correlation between pipelines and mineral extraction, men's camps, and those sort of things to a rise in violence against our Indigenous women and trafficking. And I'm just wondering if any of you would like to talk about that connection of exploitation of the land in direct connection with exploitation of women and Indigenous women. All of you or none of you, whatever is most comfortable.
Yeah, so by fighting pipelines, by fighting exploitation of the land, you are directly fighting for missing and murdered Indigenous women, because those two are entirely linked. A big reason why, especially in Minnesota, right now where we're sitting, there's 6 pipelines around us, 6 oil pipelines, with the 7th one trying to be built. And with building those pipelines, these 6 pipelines that we have around us right now, terrorizing our lands and our peoples. When they build these pipelines, they build these things called man camps, where the construction workers who work on these pipelines, who come from out of state, who come from out of the community, who aren't from around here, who don't know people from here, they come and they work on these pipelines for days, for weeks, for months. And often these men go into nearby reservations because they always place these pipelines near reservations in near underrepresented communities. They come in and they rape and they kill and they murder Indigenous women, Two-Spirit folks, and other people. And most of the time these are never checked up on, they're never written down, they're never in the data, no one ever talks about them, and this happens all the time. It's happened here in the state where we're sitting millions of times, not millions, but, so that's why it's so interlinked, because these pipeline companies and these corporations don't care about people, don't care about women. They care about their greed and the money they're making. When making pipelines, specifically Line 3, the one that I've been fighting, they have to make an environmental impact statement, which lists out the impacts that the pipeline will have on the environment and the land and the people. And within the environmental impact statement that they made for the Line 3 pipeline last year, within it, they acknowledged that their men do go into these communities, into these reservations, and assault women and rape women and kill women, and that they are aware of this and that they recognize this. And their solution was just to have a presentation, have a class for these construction workers on just raising awareness of sexual assault and what that is and what consent is. And that's the only solution that they had for what their men are doing to women. That was it. No holding them accountable, nothing else. And it's a huge problem that we have been trying and fighting so hard to help these corporations realize what they're doing, and that what they're doing is impacting all Indigenous people, people that are already, the smallest minority in the country, people that are already, like I'm more likely to die or be raped than graduate high school, and it's just all linked, and literally, like, you could go right now and fight Line 3 and you're fighting for your sister next to you, like your great-granddaughter. Because once these main camps stop and once these corporations fall down, once these governments who do not care about us are torn down and we actually go back to who we truly are and our true values, then that is when this will stop. Because living with colonization, living with these governments who do not care about us and capitalism, it's literally all interconnected. These are the reasons why we're going missing. These are the reasons why greed is here. So, anyone else has anything to say?
Yeah. And I cannot say anything better than my younger sister said around the pipelines. But I think that, we need to not only let these corporations be our viewpoint, right? So when we're looking at, as she said, colonization, what we really have to look at is the deep root causes about why is it okay that our people are being disappeared? And that just did not happen in the last decade, right? Like, missing and murdered is the newest way to say it, but it is not the first way to say it. And so looking at, looking at the impact of the United States government policies against Indian people, right? Where we're put, how we're designated, how we are invisibilized, really looking deeper. So often, when we talk about our missing relatives, we say things like, or I hear this, it's like, oh, well, she was sick, or, she was addicted, or she's a survivor of sexual abuse or sexual assault, or, a lot of times I hear like, oh, well, that family is just that way. That's bullshit, right? Just clear, sorry live stream, it's not the F word, but it's close. But having having it really is, because when you look at it, is that what we are doing is putting the onus for safety on the people who are being harmed, right? Instead of really looking at what is everything that has made it okay. When the National Institute of Justice says 55% of Native women in the United States will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime, that is more than 1 in 2. And doing this for almost 20 years, that is the closest statistic I've ever seen in my life. Is that that's not by accident, that's by design. That is done on purpose, right? And so when we look at it, we have to think very clearly around what systems that we have to dismantle. Like, what makes it okay, right? Because when we're looking at, prosecution rates, we're looking at people who actually go to jail for harming Native women, it's like this big, right? It's really, really tiny. So what kind of message does that say? In Minnesota, that message that it says is that if you hurt an Indian woman or an Indian person of all genders, right? Nothing is going to happen to you. And so whether that is explicit or not, that becomes part of the culture. And so what then do we need to do as Native people, not just ourselves, but with people from other communities that are trying to be good relatives to us? What do we do then to start shifting and reshaping that culture? How do we start talking about how the habits of white supremacy are what is killing us, right? Because if we can't say that and we are too afraid to have those conversations, right? It's just gonna keep happening, right? The habits of white supremacy are what build corporations, right? And that capitalism, colonization, and the harm that happens to us is against the natural law. It's against natural law. And so then what do we do to start dismantling, reshaping, and expanding our communities and changing the culture and changing the environment so that this becomes wholly unacceptable, not just for Indigenous people whose hearts are broken every day, but to everybody, right? So, yeah.
Miigwech, Sarah, that's awesome. Miigwech Rose, full of beautiful work you do. The connections, one that stands out most for me is teachings I received from my family, Miigwech Roxanne, to little beautiful woman, about on a cultural level is what keeps coming out, stands foremost for me when we're talking about the intersecting conversation of environmental injustices and violence against women, and that intersecting conversation. What stands out for me most would be the teachings, the cultural teachings of women and water. The women are the sacred water carriers. And as we honor women, we are honoring the water. And it's that work that the women do to protect the water, those teachings. And how women are viewed historically, gender-based violence, colonization, exploited and seen as a commodity, and how those women as sacred water carriers are harmed. That it is okay in mindsets to exploit the women or sacred water carriers and to exploit our environment as a commodity. It's how the earth and women are viewed as commodities and something to make a dollar off of and exploit. That's what stands out foremost for me, is women as sacred water carriers, and women and water are sacred. Miigwech. Also, as we're talking about the core contributors to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, we work to involve organizations that are working in these components of sexual assault, domestic violence, systemic racism, racism as a whole, and also the extraction industry, how women are viewed, changing the rape culture. So there's multiple intersecting conversations, and that's part of the work that we do to reach out to our organizations to let's bring it all to the table and see how they all intersect and contribute to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Trafficking and the rape culture, our culture as a whole, is the leading contributing factor in missing and murdered Indigenous women. The historical gender-based violence since colonization, and more recently, we're looking closer at the extraction industry. But let's bring it all to the table and learn about all of the factors, the complicated factors that contribute to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I want to say miigwech.
Thank you all very much. And part of the objective of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force is to bring all of those different agencies outside of the Indigenous community as well as inside. So, for example, we have asked the coroner's commission to have a representative there, somebody from the county sheriffs, the FBI, all of these different agencies within our state government that for one reason or other don't really communicate or share data. How can we start getting them to do that? When a deceased person comes to the coroner and they have no idea who this person is and they need to attempt to identify this person by race, oftentimes Indigenous people were misidentified, or there wasn't a lot of work went into identifying the actual race or identifying them as a Native American, Latino, or something like that. And so the task force has asked these agencies to participate. We have not had one agency that was reluctant, said this isn't worth our time. Many of them were very eager because in their own individual ability, they knew about this phenomena, but they didn't have the resources outside of their agency to deal with it. They didn't have the ability or the guidance or the leadership to start talking to other agencies. And so all of those things that you have just shared, how everybody's working in their own little silo but not talking to each other, really is a major contributor to the continuation of this. And so it's really vital that we are opening up those lines of information and data sharing especially. And that was one of the number one barriers that we identified right off the top. So one of our questions from our audience is, how can people become engaged in missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement, either as Indigenous or allies? And I'll tell you one way that you can join us in this effort is within the Missing and Murdered Task Force. We have opened up different ways to communicate and share testimony for those in the task force. If you go to the Department of Public Service, it's dps.mn.gov. We have the ability for you to call in and verbally share your story or give us ideas or information. There is a link so that you can email us and share your story, your testimony, your thoughts, your suggestions, your information. You can also come to our general task force meetings. We had one in January. The next one that we'll be having is March 5th. It is at the Northwest Indian Community Development in Bemidji. All of these meetings are open to the public. That means everybody is welcome to come and listen. There will be opportunities at these meetings to sign up and share what you have to say, or you can leave it. Again, we'll have laptops for you to write it out if that's what you need to do. All of the people that are identified as agency leaders will be there. That is one way for you to participate. And I would really encourage you to go to the website. All of our information is there. Who is participating? Feel free to contact them individually. when we are meeting, where we are meeting. There is a plethora of resources and articles and information around nationally what is going on. You spoke about the Urban Indian Governance Board. There are all these different agencies and groups working on this, and we're just trying to bring everybody together. And I was talking to somebody else, you know, if every state kind of took what I consider a very comprehensive bill from Minnesota and instituted that in their state, individual states, we would right there have our national study on missing and murdered, and we wouldn't need the federal government to do it. We can do it if we work together. And so all of you are in the community and in your Indigenous community as well as the non-Indigenous community. Do you have suggestions of how people can become engaged in this whole movement?
I would invite local community members, organizations, family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit to please come out and support the local community events. There's advocates in Minneapolis, Duluth, tribal domestic violence advocates that are working to bring awareness and support family members in individual communities throughout Minnesota. There is a Bemidji annual Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's March. Duluth is having its 5th annual march. Minneapolis is on its 6th. Now last year there was a community healing walk in Red Lake and also in Monoman. And there's talk about one possibly, I'm talking to an advocate today, she's here, from Grand Portage to try and encourage her to go ahead, start your healing walk, and it's for families. If there's families that want and need to bring awareness to this issue and help support their healing journey, please work with them in Grand Portage and just start walking. Check in with your local tribal elders for support and for them to bring prayer and a protocol and how it's the best way to support families in individual communities is to come out to the events, especially throughout the month of February. There'll be multiple events by multiple organizations and also family members working to bring awareness to their lost loved ones. That is probably the best way that you can plug in, support, help bring out awareness, and be there for families and be there for your community. Families are leading in this missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement. They are the front line of this movement. Be there for families. Families are promoting a movement that's transformative and healing. Be a part of the healing that is happening in your local community by supporting local community grassroots advocacy and activism to keep the fire lit. Miigwech.
Yes. But showing up for events is that, the nature of being invisibilized can be very frustrating, especially, not only to our families with murdered relatives, but missing relatives. And, as a mom, I guarantee you if my child went missing, I would never sleep again. Like that would be, I don't care how long that was, right? I love my son more than my own life, right? And so to know and to have people show up is really, it feels good to those families to have that support physically. And also, I want to say, especially to our non-Native relatives, is that, if you've got some June, You've got some money. Support them. These people, so many of these grassroots people are doing these between their jobs, are doing this on their own time, are things like printing flyers. That is hella expensive, right? Doing these things. So if you've got it, give it, right? Is that you don't have to know all of the things and be able to do all of the things, but if you have some of that support for them, right? See what they need. Ask what they need, right? Is it food? Is it a babysitter sometimes? If they feel safe with you as their babysitter, right? Like some of those kinds of things is like really step up. And the people who do this, work is that sometimes, they need a break. Like a rest, a minute, right? And how can we actually support them in resting, right? Like just a little bit of rest. How do we love and support them into that way, right? How do we show up as good relatives and good community into that way, and realizing who we are in the ecosystem? I look at all four of us, we hold a different place in the ecosystem around this, right? Our legislation is so important, right? My elder, and Rene Ann is of this age that I'm almost a little nervous to say elder because I don't know, but she is my elder, right? Beautiful young elder. And having, and my little sister here is looking at also understanding what part of the ecosystem that we're at, right? And to not do the thing, especially as Indian people, of like, you work for a nonprofit, you're bad because I'm grassroots, right? Like, let's not play Indian crabs, right? No, it's not an STD you get at the powwow, right? It's a thing that we do where we pull each other down, right? And so, like, my sister here, I will never run for office. It is not my place. I am so glad. And I'm so glad that she's there, right? Because that's not my work, right? But I have someone that I know who has that work, right? I don't feel like I'm half as brave as my little sister right here, right? So I'm so glad she is so brave to do that work, right? And Rene Ann blazing that trail so that I get to walk a little bit easier on it, right? And holding that place and knowing where we are on that medicine wheel so that we can balance and support and to love each other. But to really look at them, how do we create the communities, right? And so believing too, and listening and holding story. Because justice for these families does not always look like a criminal justice response. Freedom and liberation for these families does not look like someone goes to jail all of the time. Sometimes liberation means that somebody believes you. Someone is sad with you. Someone just hears. I remember she's an elder of mine, and I've been very lucky that she's adopted me as her daughter. And I went on a drive from her with a meeting. We were at Grand Portage, and she rode my car with me because we can smoke in there. So we're sitting and we're driving in the car together, and she's such a quiet woman, and she just talked the whole time. Like, I was like, hey, do you gotta pee? Right? Like, as we're going. And she was like, no, I'm good. Right? And so we're talking just like that down the road. I have never heard her speak so much in my whole life. And what we did was tell stories about her daughter's life, how funny she was, about she loved her shiny new kicks, like a white pair of sneakers was all day long. And we shared in the joys of the memories of her child that was murdered too, right? And so don't think that just because you're not, you don't work for a nonprofit, that maybe you're not an activist, that maybe our communities knew how to care for each other because we were created to be who we are. Exactly. So if your gift is making good food that takes such good care of people, that is the gift that you can bring to this. And it helps. It does. It makes a movement and it makes a change. And so to think about, as Native relatives, how we can love and support. I'm going to say it one more time, and for our non-Native relatives, please give your money to folks that really need it and can really use it to support the good work that they do.
Miigwech, sorry, I wanted to add something also for our allies and our organizations and non-Native allies too, is that to think about missing and murdered Indigenous women is not an Indigenous issue.
No.
It's a human rights issue. So there we are. There's the place. If there's any questions, to open the doors, get involved, support. I said, missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic is a human rights issue, and that we're all able to get involved. We see communities getting involved in multiple ways. How you can get involved right at home, starting at home. Communities getting involved through awesome art exhibits, using art to bring awareness, healing, sewing, skirt making, red ribbon campaigns. So there's multiple different ways to get involved other than just joining events too. We want you to support your communities, and please come out for that. But also be thinking about creative ways to help bring awareness and visibility in the media for missing and murdered Indigenous women's issue in this epidemic, in the ways of art, music, creative ways to help plug in. So miigwech.
And if I could just add, one of the really big things that you can do is support legislation, just as Rene Ann said. There will be legislation coming out around whatever we find needs to be changed in this missing and murdered task force. But right now, there are plenty of pieces of legislation, bills that are out there that address violence against women, children, men, human rights. And there are legislators that are not supporting those things. I carried the bill to add the statement of ERA, nobody shall be discriminated according to gender, this past session, and we had a hell of a fight in the state legislature, the House, to get that passed. Luckily, the DFL had the majority and we were able to pass it in the House, but it has not passed in the Senate. What you can do is get yourselves and your friends and your allies to contact your elected officials. And if your elected officials are not representing you and the community that they live in, that have elected them in the way that you feel is right, then either you run for office, and never say never, because that day could come, but make sure that the people that you are electing, from school board to county commissioner to city council to dog catcher, whatever it is, are people that are really looking at the human issues within your community and Minnesota as a whole, because they are the ones that are making those policies for you. And it's also contacting media when it's important and calling them out. Media was one of the #1 reasons that we found that stories or information about the hundreds of years of missing and murdered women have gone unnoticed. Unless it's something very sensational, like Savannah Graywin's thing, oftentimes the general public did not hear about it. We would hear it within the Indigenous pipeline and social media, but rarely would you hear it on the radio, on TV, in the newspapers. And that was another reason why so many families did not choose to make a big deal, because historically nobody cared. Nobody shared our stories, and when we came to the authorities to say somebody was missing, they oftentimes would say, well, she's probably out partying, oh, she found a new boyfriend, she's probably moved, oh, she's a runaway, call us another time. And we've heard stories after stories after stories that give us those sort of issues. So hold your elected officials accountable, and if you feel strong enough about an issue, build your own coalition along with all of these, and make sure that those policies that you feel are really important are getting heard. This is a huge election year. We have our senators up for election, we have our House members up for election, we have a presidential election. You have that power to vote somebody in, you have that power to vote somebody out. So, any last word on the subject?
Yeah, pretty much everything that these three women said is like spot on, like exactly it. And I think just to add on, you know, for me, what I've been doing is just trying to heal myself, trying to love myself, trying to finally just be a teenager for once. Going out, like actually going to parties and having fun with my friends, things I never did. Like I'm 18, I'm finally doing these like teenager things because like it's just been so hard, you know, and it's like it's just hard. And a lot of us young Native girls don't get to be young Native girls. And I think finally loving yourself, finally getting to be you, you know, learning new hobbies, like watching Netflix, you know, doing what you want to do. It's just like doing what you love, being the people you love, like being in love. That's healing, and by healing yourself, like you're healing your grandchildren, you know. You're healing like several generations of people by healing yourself. And just, you know, for men, for Native men specifically, like hold yourself and your peers and your brothers accountable for the violence that they enact on their sisters and their mothers and their daughters. That's super important too, to hold each other accountable. And, you know, especially me seeing the impact that, you know, like my father had on me, seeing him, like the impact of him, like the violence that he enacted on me. And, you know, other women is hard, and trying to unlearn that is hard, trying to unsee that is hard. But we just have to keep healing, just have to keep doing that work within ourselves. And you're right, like you don't have to leave your house to do this work. You can be at home watching Netflix and still be doing the work. If you do want to do, you know, like more like frontline work, you know, there are so many groups of Native people who are out there on the front line saying, you know, like the BIA isn't doing this work, the government isn't doing this work, trying to find these women. So what we're going to do is go out and actually search for these women day and night and work with these families and go out into the woods outside and actually look for them. There's a lot of groups that are doing that right now, and that's super important to do as well. And to get involved with those groups that are doing that, if that's what you feel like you should be doing. And if you're a young person in the Twin Cities, or if you know of a young person in the Twin Cities that is Indigenous or Black or Brown, I'm a co-founder of an organization called Meta Liberation, which it's just a group of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks only to just heal, to do what we want to do, to organize, sit, do art, you know, whatever we want to do that's healing, which is a space that we've never really seen before in Minnesota, a space that's for us, and that's, you know, we're not being tokenized, you know, no one's telling us what to do, and that's super important too. And you can even create these own spaces, like in this college, like in whatever, and by doing that, like you're doing that work too. So yeah, we'll do that to everyone.
So you, Rose, you touched on the youth and what sort of opportunities or things are happening with the youth, and you're obviously an incredible leader and bringing more and more youth into sort of a productive mode for your community. We have a question here, and I'm wondering if you would like to start the answering of this, is how media influences the youth and sexuality. That's a really tough one. And I think if you look back on some of the old movies and shows and the permissive, the inappropriate language and attitudes that used to be portrayed, especially around Native American folks. My husband had an old John Wayne movie on last night, and I sat there and looked at it and went, oh my God, this used to be acceptable. This used to be the norm. The disrespect for and the dismissal of Native American men, the sexualization of the women that have held tight in our culture for so long that we are so hard trying to change. So the question is, and you also mentioned about how the youth are leading the movement for change, but how do you feel that our media is influencing people around sexuality and the Indigenous communities, as well as other marginalized communities that are often victims at a higher rate? And just really appreciate the work you do with the youth as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's super hard to grow up and like knowing, especially going to a school where there's not many other Indigenous kids, that the only thing that, when you tell them you're Native, the first thing that they think of is like a sexualized like Native Pocahontas Halloween costume, things like that. That's super hard, and that affects Indigenous people everywhere. Because the reason why they're killing us is because they don't see us as people, right? They see us as Halloween costumes, and they see us as mascots. So, and that's just, like saying like everything's interconnected again. Like by fighting mascots, you're fighting like for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I think that although like this conversation is important, I think it's also good not to blame Indigenous women for owning their sexuality, and especially Native sex workers. Their work is valid, and just because they're doing that work or they're owning up to their sexuality, that doesn't mean that it's okay for them to be killed or raped, and it's not their fault. I think that's super important to bring to the conversation as well. But just in general, yeah, for sure, like seeing everything on social media and the way that Native women are portrayed, especially when you look up like Native women online, like you'll see just like these headdresses and bikinis, and like that's not what we are. Native people are so modest, if anything. It's, like just to speak for my nation, like we're super modest. Like our Native women, like we wear skirts, like we wear long, like you know what I mean. Like we don't even show our skin, and that's not who we are. But that doesn't mean that we can't own up to our sexuality, be sexual beings, and be who you want to be. So.
Yes. And I think too that someone who is getting closer to 40 than I am 30, right? Feeling like I'm definitely not a youth anymore. In my mind I am. But also looking at our sacred responsibility as aunties and grandmas and older relatives too, is to not only talk about sexual violence, but healthy sexuality. Like, do you know how to have a conversation with the youth about like what's okay? Can you talk about sex without like freaking out, right? Can you answer questions? This I will not say for the live stream, but if you want some funny stories, I've got some questions, right? That makes that conversation really, really open, because what is really strange to me is that people will sit down and talk to me about sexual violence all day, but like, if I say the word masturbation, they lose their minds, right? And they will not, run away, right? And that isn't good, right? Like, we have to be able to be really open about it, because if we're open both ways, I have a nephew who, I'm going to say it like this, I was given the opportunity to talk to him about sex when he was about 13, right? And so him and I had a day of it, and he wanted to crawl under a rock and die by the end of it because he was so embarrassed. We were figuring it out, having this open conversation, and the conversation continued, right, about like everyone's sacred sexuality, right? And that like our sister said here is that, like rape is not a natural consequence of anything. It just isn't. It's against the natural law, right? And so, but then when we talk about our healthy sexuality, that can be joyful, because a lot of times what I've seen from youth in my life is that, especially Indigenous youth, is they're put on this binary of either promiscuous or like saint-like, and there's nothing in the middle, when there's actually like a whole lot in the middle for them. And it's really super healthy, and that is actually reclaiming our Indigenous identity, is like letting youth know you can have sex just for fun in a very healthy, respectful, consensual kind of way, right? And so really being open to that conversation as well, and to get that out there beyond sexual violence, is our responsibility to our youth, so that they can come and ask us questions as we are in, the western door or the northern door, right? That is our responsibility to our younger relatives in the eastern door and the southern door, is to have really, really open conversations, and they can be funny. You don't have to be good at it. Just open to it, right? And that is also decolonizing the way that we work around this.
One beautiful thing that we've been seeing here in the past 10 years, and Rose, I could speak directly to this beautiful Rose, is reclaiming that identity on a public format, and every day, in the work that you do every day, decolonizing, but reclaiming that identity in the skirts. We've got the skirt making that has come back. Rose and her jingle dress, very proud to see you in that jingle dress, and the ribbon skirts at the events. But it's just setting that example too, and many girls are coming out in this youth group with the ribbon dresses, and with pride, reclaiming that identity. So I think that's very important. It's how we're viewed and how you're portrayed. And so I want to say miigwech for promoting those beautiful skirts and the beautiful ways of being, and our jingle dresses out here. Not just in the powwows, but also out at the events, and so that the girls are viewed more culturally and with that cultural respect. So reclaiming our identity and changing that image, that public image, is huge. And the youth are leading on that. Miigwech.
Thank you all for sharing your thoughts, your life experiences, your expertise in the areas that you've presented. Could we all give them a round of applause? The next part of this discussion is a roundtable discussion, and it will be moderated by Hannah Smith. Hannah, would you like to come down and share your next session? Thank you.